The nation was now an empire, but with that imperialism came a sense of self-consciousness, a sense of not self-loathing, but an idea that maybe unbridled capitalism needed some reflection. The U.S. people witnessed a reform movement in the early 20th century and really the end of the 19th century, unlike it had never witnessed in its entire past, rivaling the Second Great Awakening in scope of the 1830s and 1840s. This new movement would call itself progressivism. Progressives were in all political parties. They were Democrats, they were Republicans, they were reform-minded in their focus and sought to use government to bring about societal change. That's what distinguishes them and separates them from those that have gone before. And certainly there have been reform movements. In fact, some of the antecedents to the progressive movement of the 19th and 20th century, not to be confused with modern progressives, the traditional progressives of this day, of the late 19th century, early 20th century, grew out of the Greenback Labor Party. And the Greenback Labor Party tells you in its name what they desired. They desired greenbacks, paper money, and concessions to labor. Specifically set wages, all of the benefits, a social safety net. And all of those ideas are going to be absorbed into the populist movement, which the populist movement was flourishing and active in the 1880s and the 1890s. But populism supporting William Jennings Bryan began to give way to the modern progressive movement. Now, progressivism is going to be, and in fact, later when we talk about the various progressive authors and their advocacy, all of them are going to be socialist, not communist, but they're going to be socialist, and they're going to want to use government to restrain capitalism and to bring about positive reforms that they see society needs to make. But many of them would argue that they advocate the socialism to prevent something far worse, communism. Theodore Roosevelt, who's going to be the poster child, if you will, for national progressivism. Now, he would say that he wants to see modified capitalism to prevent the worst isms from taking over, whether that be anarchism, communism, or full-bore socialism. He would argue for modified capitalism. Theodore Roosevelt would never call himself a socialist, and he's certainly not one of the writers, but he takes progressivism to the national stage. Progressives are at every level of government. They are at the city, the county, the state, and the federal level. In fact, it would be at the state level, especially Western states, that progressives have their greatest success. But it's the national agenda that we're ultimately going to focus on, and the progressive presidents, the dominant, the overshadowing, overarching progressive president is, of course, Theodore Roosevelt. But to a lesser extent, William Howard Taft is a progressive, and Woodrow Wilson is a progressive, although his progressivism differs greatly from that of Theodore Roosevelt. But those are your progressive presidents. You could even make a case for William McKinley being a progressive president as well, but he more sets the stage for Roosevelt than being a true reformer. So let's look at some of the issues, some of the ideas that progressives had. And these are at the local, state, and federal level. And there are about 13 of them, and we'll go through and explain them. I don't have slides for all of them, but we'll look at the progressive idea in general. And the first of those ideas is women's suffrage. The idea that American women need the vote. Not because they're also citizens, not because they are disenfranchised, although that is a part, and the feminist suffragettes would argue that they should be given their due. But ultimately, the progressives don't give them the right to vote because they are women and citizens. They give them the right to vote because they want to purify the issues. Women were seen as the font of purity within the republic. And so by incorporating them into progressive thought, the idea was they will purify, they will bring their virtue to politics and remove corruption from the electorate. How's that working out for us? You see the various signs and arguments that the suffragettes made demanding the right to vote. One of my favorite stories a few years ago, MIT students went to the streets of New York City and had a petition for people to sign calling for an end to woman suffrage. And they got tens of thousands of signatures on this, men and women, not realizing that woman suffrage means the woman's right to vote. In fact, one person commented and was caught on camera saying, I don't want to see women suffer, so yes, I'm in favor of ending woman suffrage. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the feminization of the electorate, bringing women into the electorate so that they can vote. And I'll use President Wilson as an example. One of the quotes, and it's hard to find, but one of the quotes that Woodrow Wilson made in reference to women voting, he said that there is more value in teaching a dog to talk than giving women the right to vote. But he said that in 1912. By 1916, he was a firm advocate of woman suffrage. Why? Because in 1914, World War I is going to begin, and he wants to see the United States stay out of it. And it was his firm belief that no woman is going to support a foreign policy that sends American boys to die in some foreign land. Defending the homeland is one thing, but fighting in another country, quite different. And so he wanted to feminize the electorate, bring women into the voting booth so that his foreign policy of staying out of the war would be affirmed. And so women's suffrage. And let's face it, women tend to be, and I won't broadly generalize, but women tend to be more compassionate, more caring, more concerned about an individual's interests than men tend to be. And progressives wanted to harness that. A second issue is that of child labor. Child labor. Child labor was seen as not a death sentence, but a life sentence in servitude. These children are from families of 10, 15, 20 children in the household. As the older students reached an age, their teenage years, or sometimes even younger, they were sent to work in the factories. They were sent to make a paycheck. And being children, they didn't make as much as mom or dad working, but their contribution to the family income tended to be all that kept these families solvent. And so child labor was seen as absolutely necessary for the survival of some families. But progressives opposed child labor because these children are going to be forever locked in a cycle of dependency. This is the only job they're ever going to have. They're not going to be able to go to school. They're not going to be able to be educated. They're not going to be able to advance in their career beyond where they are. Most of these children, because they can't go to school, aren't going to be able to read. They're not going to be able to do math. They're not going to be able to develop critical thinking skills. They are forever stuck in this manual labor job. And in fact, many of these kids will never live to see their majority. They will either be hurt in some industrial accident, or in the case of the kids in the slide working in the glass factory, they're probably dead by 40 because of the glass in their lungs. And so the end of child labor was seen as absolutely vital so that those kids can go to school, better themselves, get good jobs, and advance their families. Upward mobility. which, despite what politicians today, they use that term, the American dream, as a football, and it's interpreted different, but traditionally the American dream was children doing better than their parents. And so an end to child labor was seen as vital for them to ever live or reach for the American dream. A third issue that progressives tended to advocate was temperance and prohibition. The difference between temperance and prohibition is temperance means the abstinence from certain beverages, the limiting of alcohol consumption, and prohibition being the outright elimination of alcohol. And this picture tends to demonstrate, both the pictures in this slide tend to demonstrate what progressivism was all about. You see that they're primarily white women. They're certainly upper middle class or lower rich classes. And they have time on their hands to be involved in social causes. And so their advocacy is for the prohibition and temperance of alcohol. And the Women's Christian Temperance Union being the dominant organ for prohibition. There are others, but they are the primary one. And they advocate, as the banner says, for God, for home, for native land. Now, in looking at that and thinking it through, you understand the for God. There are religious groups that believe alcohol is a sin and ungodly. And so most of these women, whether they believe that or not, believe it certainly makes the household more godly if the husband and wife are not consuming alcohol. So they're going to advocate the elimination of alcohol for God. For home, one of their key goals is that and they use this as a selling point, if you eliminate alcohol from the household, that there will be more disposable income to be spent on the children, to be spent on the household, to lift individuals up out of poverty. And here's the height of irony. Prohibition, when it goes into effect in the 1920s, they are proven to be true. Prohibition does bring a rise in disposable household income. The prohibitionists were right. The prohibitionists advocated that family violence would decrease with the elimination of alcohol. And we have figures that back up that very assertion, that during the period of prohibition, family violence decreased. Crime rates decreased. Work absenteeism decreased. So across the board, the elimination of alcohol was seen to be an accomplishment of this progressive goal with prohibition. By the way, it's accomplished with the 18th Amendment. So the 18th Amendment eliminates alcohol. Now, that's not going to come until the 1919, 1920. So it's down the road a ways, but they are going to see the fulfillment of their goal. But notice the third slogan on their banner, for native land. They're not talking about eliminating alcohol so Native Americans won't get drunk. They're talking about America as their native land. And what this is, and we'll get the next slide will support this, but before we move to that, what they are advocating, progressives tended to dislike immigration. And they disliked the various ethnic groups moving into the United States. And in fact, you could identify in the turn of the century, you could identify various ethnic groups with the beverage of choice. Now, I'll just throw out a couple. Think in your mind, what ethnic group do you associate with vodka? Of course, the Russians. What ethnic group do you associate with champagne? The French. Wine? Well, the French and the Italians. Beer? Germans. Whiskey? The Irish. So the various ethnic groups, as they come into the United States, became identified by the alcohol they consume. And one of the ideas of of the temperance and prohibition movement is if you can place restraints on the alcohol and eliminate the alcohol, then these immigrant groups aren't going to want to immigrate to the United States and they'll stay home. So prohibition is a reaction to immigration as well. And so the progressives are anti-immigration. Now you have to be careful because they're not anti-immigrant per se. They are anti-immigration as a whole, as the cartoon demonstrates in the slide. You have these current fat cats trying to prohibit the immigrant from getting off the boat, but their shadows reflect their ancestors who had immigrated and what they looked like. And so the progressives tended to be anti-immigration, not because they hated people, but there's always in progressivism, each one of these issues has a downside. Anti-immigration is their issue because they don't want to see the workforce diluted. They believe that if the working class received a higher wage, that they would profit from that and be less inclined toward crime, less inclined toward vices, if they made a higher wage, or as we would use today, a living wage. And so by preventing immigration, they are preventing the dilution of the workforce. As each new wave of immigrants came into America, whether from Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania or Russia or Italy or any of the Slovak nations or Poland or wherever, as they immigrated into America, you see the new immigrants willing to work for less than the established immigrants. And businesses would fire the current batch and hire the new batch to increase their profit margin. So if there are no new immigrants, then labor and labor unions advocating for a higher wage and higher standards will have more effect, and thus a rising tide lifts all boats economically. And so they are anti-immigration, and this leads to a number of anti-immigration bills, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, a resurrection of the bill that Rutherford B. Hayes had vetoed, but brought back in the 1880s and 1890s. There'll be multiple Chinese Exclusion Acts. The Geary Act, just to name a few. They actually accomplished this anti-immigration legislation in the 1920s, which we'll talk about later. But in the 1920s, the Emergency Quota Act and then the anti-immigration bills of the 1920s not only slow, but bring to just a trickle all new immigration. In fact, in the 1920s, the United States, for the first time in its history, will have more people leave America than come to America. So anti-immigration. But the whole thrust, if you will, of the progressive movement is by stopping the immigration, you help the immigrants and the workers that are already here. So while being anti-immigration, the progressives tend to be pro-immigrant that is already in America. And they wanted to aid and use those immigrants. Let's not forget, immigrants, as they become citizens, are voters, and progressives, like any political group, want to win elections and have their ideas dominate. So just like with woman suffrage, bringing more women into the voting booth, by getting more immigrants involved in voting, you're going to be able to accomplish your agenda. And so immigrant aid, providing medical services on the left to immigrant children, whether that be vaccinations, whether that be child care. You see the nurse coming into the immigrant's home and helping her take care of the children. Also part of that is to help various ethnic groups get beyond their ethnic strife, and because you couple this with child labor laws, Women now have to go into the workforce. They need to leave their children that are preschool age somewhere. So the idea of whole house, houses set aside, areas that are centers for immigrants of all groups together and gain literature, legal advice, medical support, but also to interact. And a progressive idea was, as long as you can get immigrant children, a Polish child to play with a Russian child, and they grow up playing together on the playground, that they're going to grow up friends and move beyond the ethnic rivalries that had plagued the various ethnic groups. And you could pick any two. I chose Russian and Polish, but it could have been any two ethnic groups that had plagued them for centuries and or millennia, that they could move beyond that by interacting on the playground. But it also becomes a center for interaction of the families, holding regular picnics and regular events. This particular one, and it's not with irony, they did it intentionally, Whole House opening on May the 1st, May Day, a labor and socialist and communist holiday. So on May 1st, Whole House opens, and you have all the fun and games and frivolities of families getting together. But Whole House, run by Jane Addams and Ellen Starr, became a center in Chicago, but there were houses in Boston, in New York, elsewhere, to bring the community together. So you have woman suffrage, you have prohibition, you have child labor, you have anti-immigration, you have immigrant aid. In previous lectures, we've talked about the ethnic reform movement of W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP, but that's part of the progressive movement as well, primarily northern progressivism, not southern progressivism. But as a spokesperson for ethnic issues, there would be numerous writers, but Ida Wells being the primary one, advocating and being a strong voice for anti-lynching reform. And then we're going to spend, as we look at the presidents, we're going to focus on another progressive issue, that of business reform. But where progressives really gained traction out west, the western states, more so than in the east, the already established states, and they certainly never accomplished much of this. A couple of them they did, about half of them they did at the national level, but specifically political reforms. First off, to remove corruption from the electorate. They believed that the idea of voting cattle and bosses being able to see how their workers voted needed to be taken away. And so the idea of the Australian ballot or the secret ballot was advocated by progressives. Back in the day, a boss would gather together, a foreman would gather together his workers, and management would provide money for those workers, and you would take your workers down in mass to the polling place, and they would vote. And the foreman would look over their shoulder to make sure they voted correctly, voted for the proper political machine or political bosses or candidates, whatever the issue was. And at the end of the day, they might make $1 for their vote. Now, the concept of voting cattle, those same voters would then be taken to another polling place and then paid to vote again, and then taken to another polling place and paid to vote again. And on a good election day, you could vote 5, 6, 7 times, making a month's worth of wages in one day. So progressives said you needed to eliminate that from politics because people needed to be free to vote their conscience, not their paycheck. And so the Australian ballot, or the secret ballot, would eliminate the foreman from the polling place and would allow you to cast a fair ballot. I think today we might have gone too far with some of this. I've a couple of years ago took a blind lady down to the polling place and to help her vote. And they let me go into the polling booth with her because she had to say she wanted me with her. And I read the ballot to her. Well, she would ask me who I thought she should vote for. And the poll watchers would say, well, you can't do that. So as I would read the ballot to her, I could tell her, well, I voted for so-and-so. And if she said, okay, I want that one too, I could vote. But I couldn't lead her to a candidate. And then they made sure they sat with me as I read to her. The last time I voted, I took my 3-year-old daughter with me. She likes hitting the button as I select, and I'll tell her when to hit it. Well, they told me I couldn't do that because that was actually her voting. And my argument was, no, she was selecting the candidate. I chose her, but then I hit the button to cast the ballot at the end. So we had a disagreement. I think it was probably more the poll watcher just needing something to do. She was bored. But the Australian ballot, that's going to be incorporated by most locations and becomes federal in its scope, the Australian ballot. Instituted to bring a reform and to eliminate corruption in the balloting process. Another political idea advocated by the progressives was to eliminate the tariff as an institute for raising money for the government. The way a tariff works is it's a tax on imports. The higher that tax, the more protection American companies are afforded from foreign competition. Thus, companies, management likes, and to some extent labor, likes tariffs. It protects their industry. But the consumer has to buy goods that have their prices increased because of that tariff. And the progressives argued that the tariff had become a major source of corruption in the U.S. Senate. And it was a political football that corrupted the process. So the progressives advocated elimination of the tariff as a political entity. But if you take the tariff away, the government has no way to raise money. And so progressives argued that the tariff should be replaced with an income tax. And so the progressives throughout the progressive era are going to advocate the imposition of an income tax and have it shot down every time it's put into a bill by the Supreme Court. So the way you make something constitutional is the passage of a constitutional amendment, and the American people approved the 16th Amendment, which is the income tax, during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Another political entity, another political creation that the progressives advocated was the elimination of senatorial corruption. They said because the Constitution set up the system so that the senators were not accountable, that lack of accountability led to corruption in the Senate and monopolies buying senatorial votes, which is true. They did buy senatorial votes. I firmly believe that the medicine was just as dangerous as the disease, however. The Constitution, as it was originally created, the American people only elected one person. That person, which reflected their interest, was their local representative. And each of the states, apportioned out, had their representatives, but they were the ones who reflected the interest of the people. As the Constitution then created the Senate was designed to reflect the will of the states. So with the state interest, the Constitution said the senators would be elected by the state legislatures So indirectly, the people vote for their state legislatures. The state legislature then elects 2 senators to go to Washington, D.C. and represent the interest of the states. Then for president, you see a mixing of the two. We live in a federalist system, and that was reflected in the election. The people vote for a candidate, but we don't elect presidents on popular vote. We elect presidents based on electoral vote, which is divided up amongst the states based upon their representation in Congress. Your representatives plus your senators equals the number of electoral votes that each state gets. And then the party interests are reflected by all electors from Republican or all electors from Democrat giving all of their votes to that particular candidate. So you see in the presidency, federalism condensed into the election of that executive office. The people voting for electors, the electors then voting for president. The interest of the people, the interest of the states reflected in the presidency, who was seen as the custodian of the people and the states. But because the progressives and kind of the law of unintended consequences, the progressives say, wait a minute, you can't, because of the legislatures electing the senators aren't responsible to anyone, and thus we need to change the system. And so what they did is the direct election of senators, which in the 1920s, the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, it gives the people direct vote for their representatives and for their senators. The law of unintended consequences, though, is this reduced the power of the states. And nature abhors a vacuum. So with the state power declining, the Senate reflecting the interest of the people and of the federal government, the interest of the states has declined over the last century. And so the next, after direct election of senators, the last 3 political maneuvers for the political ideas for the progressives are the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. The initiative, the referendum, and the recall. The initiative is that if your legislature is not giving you the bills that the people want, the people can initiate legislation. And the way this generally is set up, and it's only at the state level and it's only out west, but that the people can vote for legislation, but to get it on the ballot, they have to get a number of signatures. And they'll take usually the previous presidential election and they'll say, okay, 50,000 people voted in the presidential election. So you have to get 5,000 signatures to bring a piece of legislation before the electorate. And so the initiative goes out. They get the 5,000 signatures, and the initiative legislation says that whatever law that the people want, regardless of what the legislature wants, it then appears on a ballot, and the people of the state get to vote for it. If the people vote for that piece of legislation, it becomes law whether the legislature wants it to or not. The people directly involved in government. The next is referendum. What if your representative gives you laws that you don't like? Referendum says, once again, using that ballot process, that petition process, you gain a percentage of the previous presidential voters. So using the 5,000 again, once you get your 5,000 signatures, the referendum says the law that is in question is then pulled off the books, and at the next vote is presented to the people. And if the people vote that law down, it comes off the books and goes away, and the legislature can't bring it back. So it's the people doing away with laws they disagree with. And then finally is recall. That if the people want to recall an elected representative before their time in office is up, then they can go through the petition process, get the number of signatures, and then once they reach that number of signatures, that politician has to stand for re-election. And if voted out of office, a replacement is voted in. If confirmed by the people, then they stay in office. And so we have this popularization of the electorate and the desire by the progressives to have the people advocate on their... The idea being that rational, reasoned people will want to be involved in politics. They will want to be involved in the issues, and they will take responsibility for the issues, and they will take back control of their lives from government. Now, the progressive movement is built upon the literature of the age. And so we're going to quickly go through the authors and writers, and by no means is this an exhaustive list, but an examination of some of the authors and writers that advocated progressive ideas. Universally, from beginning of this group to the end, they are socialist, and they all focus on different aspects of American life. And their advocacy is, people, you need to get involved and change the way government functions. Government is the only force powerful enough to change things in the direction we want. The first of those authors is Jacob Riis. He's probably the best known of these writers. Theodore Roosevelt will give them a name. He will call them muckrakers, borrowing the name from a John Bunyan character in the book Pilgrim's Progress. The muckraker was a man who raked out, was condemned, and it was self-condemned to clean out the stables and rake the filth off the floor, because he felt his sins were so great that he couldn't look up to heaven and see the virtue and greatness or the forgiveness that had been available to him. And so he self-condemns to always look at the filth on the ground. And Theodore Roosevelt's idea was, hey, muckrakers, you journalists, you don't always need to look at the filth. Sometimes you need to look at how great America is. Sometimes you need to look at how good things are. So he gives them the name muckrakers, and it stuck. Now, Jacob Riis was a close friend. In fact, the cartoon in the center is Theodore Roosevelt as police chief in New York City, walking a beat, and the man behind him is Jacob Riis. They walked a beat together, and Roosevelt, as police chief, was interested in this case, a policeman sleeping on the job. Roosevelt believed in police interacting with the community, police doing their jobs, and so as police commissioner, he took his job serious. But Jacob Riis is probably best known not for his work on police reform, but on his book, How the Other Half Lives, an examination of the tenements of New York and the lower classes living in those tenements and just exactly what their plight was. Now, How the Other Half Lives isn't a long treatise. It's more of a photojournalist essay. It's one of the first real photographic books that contains pictures and illustrations of the suffering and the pain of immigrants into New York City. And so Jacob Riis is probably the best known and the most lauded of the muckrakers. Probably another muckraker that you are familiar with is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair examined conditions in his novel, but it's a novel that is mostly based in fact. The conditions were true, the characters were fictional. And he examines the meatpacking industry of Chicago and Wisconsin, as you see with the upper right, meat inspectors, and the lower, the two pictures in the slide showing meat inspectors looking at the processing of sausage and the processing of pork. Upton Sinclair, in his examination of conditions, found them to be deplorable. and he published his book, The Jungle, while Theodore Roosevelt was president. One of the stories was that Theodore Roosevelt was always a healthy eater, especially breakfast, and he tried to read a book before breakfast each morning. He was a very fast reader, and he retained everything that he read. And he read The Jungle and was so upset that he couldn't eat breakfast that morning. And he called in government officials to go examine the conditions to prove Upton Sinclair wrong. That if he was wrong and if he was fabricating it, he wanted to bring suit against Upton Sinclair for defaming the meat industry. But instead, quite the opposite. He found that Upton Sinclair, if anything, had underplayed conditions in the meatpacking industry. And so Roosevelt will immediately institute and use advocates in Congress to bring legislation to end the conditions in the meatpacking industry and bring in government inspectors to make sure they performed those actions according to the law. Henry Demarest Lloyd is another famous muckraker, writing the book Wealth Against Commonwealth. Wealth Against Commonwealth. It's an examination of Standard Oil and the business practices of Standard Oil. And he would gain renown for his 1894 attack on Standard Oil, calling for government legislation against monopolies. And he would become the target of many lawsuits, which would be echoed in the writings of Ida Tarbell. A lot of these writers, and I've put their books on these slides, but on Ida Tarbell, along with many of the others, she wrote the original works as chapters in monthly publications, especially McClure's Magazine. And so you see McClure's Magazine here with Ida Tarbell's essay, would be a chapter out of her book, on the history of Standard Oil Company and the practices engaged. You also see on the slide, you also see in this magazine a chapter from Lincoln Steffens' book, Lincoln Steffens, The Shame of the Cities. And so he exposed how local corruption, how business interests bought city officials and gained undue control of public works, public utilities, water, gas, oil, fire industry, all of those falling under the control of big business, as he called it, to the shame of the cities. In the picture with the three individuals in it, you see Lincoln Steffens, and in the middle of that picture, you see Robert La Follette. He's going to be a Wisconsin governor and one of the leading state advocates for progressivism. So Lincoln Steffens and the Shame of the Cities. Now, I gotta say as an aside, this guy is what I envision from the old 1930s TV show, The Little Rascals. This is what Alfalfa would look like grown up. But Thorsten Veblen and his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, was an attack on the idea that the rich are needed in society and that the rich contribute to the intellect, to the intellectual development of the nation. And so with an examination of the contributions made by the wealthy and the elite, Thorsten Veblen tries to dismember that idea and show that it is the working class, especially through the use of the term conspicuous consumption. And I love the picture here of the dinner party on horseback, that they've brought hay and dirt into a restaurant, and a lot of the diners are eating on horseback because they can. Conspicuous consumption. Another of the muckrakers is Ray Stannard Baker. That is his pen name. His real name was David Grayson. And he went into the South and wrote an expose called Following the Color Line, an examination of race relations and how Jim Crow was destroying the black community. John Spargo and the Bitter Cry of the Children, an advocate for child labor reform, which we've already talked about, but his book gave that foundation and substance. Theodore Dreiser. Now, his books, once again, like The Jungle, are fiction, and he called it the Trilogy of Desire. And the trilogy, the Financier, the Titan, and the Stoic, showing very much like others that the Thorstein Veblen and others, that the wealthy were more playboys and playgirls rather than contributing to society, and showing the tactics they were willing to go to protect their wealth. Probably his most famous work, though, I didn't put up here, is Sister Carrie, an examination of prostitution and the descent of the poorer classes into prostitution. Frank Norris and his work, The Octopus, once again a fictitious book, but written, only the characters fictitious, the rest of the book being accurate. The Octopus attacking the rail system and the monopoly of the railroads by various groups in California, especially its assault on the wheat industry. The Octopus was meant to be volume 1 in a trilogy, but Frank Norris dies before he can write the other 2 works, so it stands alone as a muckraking attack on the railroads. And then, although not a muckraker, he's highly influential in the progressive movement. Progressives wanted efficiency. They wanted standardization. They wanted to get away from everybody doing their own thing in government and politics and business, and they wanted standardization throughout the country. And Frederick Winslow Taylor wrote the book, The Principles of Scientific Management. And he says countries like businesses can be managed, can be run from a blueprint. And so progressives are going to implement a number of his ideas at the state and local level and try to implement them at the higher level. New types of government are created. The city manager system and the city council system come into existence because of the progressive movement. You see progressivism highly effective at the state level, and we'll just look at a couple or a few of the most successful progressives and use that as a segue into the politics of national progressivism. The most successful governor of a state that implemented his progressive agenda was Governor Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. La Follette would even be a presidential candidate in 1912, but forced to drop out because of health issues, and Theodore Roosevelt will take his place and run for a 3rd term as a progressive. Governor Charles Evans Hughes of New York, highly effective as a governor, and then later becomes Secretary of State and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But he will pick up where Theodore Roosevelt, when Theodore Roosevelt's kicked upstairs into the vice presidency, Charles Evans Hughes becomes the progressive governor of New York. Hiram Johnson, governor of California, will attack and eliminate railroad corruption in California and bring about California control of public utilities. And then, of course, as the segue into the next lecture on the presidencies of McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, is Governor Theodore Roosevelt, who very briefly held the governorship of New York, but held it long enough that his political agenda angered the political bosses, and they kicked him upstairs, kicked him into the vice presidency. all of them implementing those progressive ideas and seeking to bring social change through government power. And Roosevelt will then take that and become the face of the Progressive Party, the progressive agenda, as President of the United States with the death of William McKinley.